Israelis who were committing an act of piracy, except nobody in this country calls it that, because you can't do that on the high seas. If it happened off the coast of Somalia, it would be called piracy. But the boats were attacked and captured. On the little boat where I was on, I think 11 people were injured, but no one was killed. On the big ship, the Mavi Marmara, 9 people were killed. One of them was an American, and the other 8 were Turks. But the media never talks about the fact that one of these people was an American. They took us under armed guard to Israel, where we were marched off the ship onto the shore, and some of the people who had done this before, the people who sponsored the little group I was with, said they will ask you to sign a paper in Hebrew. It's a paper in which you admit what they're charging you with. If you sign the paper, they will deport you right away. If you don't sign the paper, you go off to jail. So there were 5 of us from the Free Palestine movement, and we all agreed that we would sign the paper. 2 of them had already been in Israeli jails before. When they got ashore, they took us ashore individually. 3 of the people decided they wouldn't sign the paper, and they got off to jail, and I didn't know that. I got off and signed the paper, and the man said, okay, now we are going to deport you. I said, why? He said, you have broken, I want you to listen to this. You have broken an Israeli law. I said, I've been here for 4 minutes. What Israeli law have I broken? You have entered the country illegally. I said, what? You know, I entered the country with my hands in the air, you know, and a gun in my back. You call that entering the country illegally? Yes. And now you will be expelled. So I was. And I was one of the first people to get back from the flotilla and spent a lot of time talking on television about this particular experience. But I want to mention just in passing that although the Israelis expelled me and everybody else eventually, they kept all our stuff. They kept the suitcase, the camera, they kept the razor, they kept the dirty laundry, they kept the computer, they kept everything. And I left with the shirt on my back and my passport, that was it. And the State Department was so concerned about this that they never did anything. Which is something that I'm quite used to, you know. They never criticized the Israelis for killing an American either, or did they make any serious efforts to get back the stuff of American citizens who had done nothing wrong. But the first, when I got home, onto television, and one of the television anchor people said, well, the Israelis have announced that the people engaged in the flotilla were all savage, murdering, killing terrorist, Shiite fundamentalist murderers. What do you have to say about that? And I said, well, how did you expect them to describe us as peace-loving tree huggers? Of course we're all murdering savages. But nobody did much murdering there. Were there people on the flotilla who were hostile to Israel? Yeah, I'm sure there were. There were several hundred people. Were there people on the boat who didn't have any interest other than humanitarian? Yeah, that's it. You know. I have gotten engaged in discussions of this issue with people who support the Israeli position. And they say the purpose of the blockade is quite simple. The purpose of the blockade is to keep weapons from coming into Gaza from outside. I said, well, that's easy to understand until you notice that there's also a blockade on the landward side. Is that to keep weapons from coming in from Israel? No. It's to ensure that certain things don't get into Palestine, into Gaza, that the Gazan people could use, like food, like medicine, like power, like fuel for the power plants, like pencils. Mr. Netanyahu described it exactly and succinctly. He said, we are going to put Gaza on a diet. And they couldn't bring in school books or pencils because those could be used in an act of war. Make little paper airplanes. Israel has no right to be in Gaza. That's an illegally occupied piece of territory. It's in violation of every international law you could have. And since they have no right to be there, they have no right to impose a blockade, and they have no right to attack ships who are trying to bring in relief supplies for the people of Gaza. They told the flotilla, the leaders, I was merely a soldier, they told the Israelis said, you bring that stuff to us, and we will take it to Gaza. And the response was, no, the reason we're taking it to Gaza is that you don't let things like that in. For example, we had in the little boat we were escorting 156 electric wheelchairs. You've seen them around, the little golf carts, just for one person. The Israelis captured those, and they delivered them all to Gaza after removing the batteries. Thank you very much. What a nice gesture. You know, here's your electric wheelchair, but you can't use it. They're tough. There's a big flotilla gathering now. There's going to be an American ship, boat on it this time, boats from a number of countries. And I'm not going again. I'm very worried about what the Israelis will do this time, because the Israeli government has made it very, very clear over the years, and they've said this many, many times, that if you provoke us, our response will be disproportional. And if they didn't stop flotillas by killing 9 people, what will they do this time? Because it worries me. No one in this room, I hope, would disagree with the following statement. Everyone in his or her right mind, I repeat, everyone who is in his or her right mind, and we all recognize that not everybody qualifies for inclusion, okay, doesn't want anything bad to happen to anyone in the Middle East. Not one Israeli, not one Palestinian, not one American, or not one of anybody else. But the simple horror of the situation is that horrible things have happened, are happening, and are going to happen to all of those 3 groups plus others because of what is and what is not happening in Gaza, Jerusalem, and the West Bank. And I hope I'm wrong. Some years ago, I got lauded by National Public Radio for having exactly suggested precisely what was going to happen if we invaded Iraq. And the man said to me, doesn't that make you proud? And I said, of course not. I didn't want to be right. I didn't want it to happen. I'm just telling you what's going to go on if you do invade Iraq. And I can't tell you what's likely to happen if the United States continues supporting Israel in its violation of every single rule and law and behavioral trait that we think is important. Because I've served in Egypt, one of the reasons that Mr. Mubarak is no longer the president, one of the reasons, is because the Egyptian people did not like being complicit in supporting what is being done to the Palestinian people just on the other side of the border. Try it this way. If there are groups of people in this country, groups of women, who are actively involved in improving the situation of women in some other country, women with whom they have no connection whatsoever except the fact that they're women. You know, it's different race, different religion, different culture, different everything. And if it's true that American women are concerned about that, why would anybody be surprised to discover that Arabs care what happens to Arabs? They do. It doesn't mean they necessarily love them or like them extremely well, but they don't like somebody else beating up on them. And the Egyptian people are tired of having been required or encouraged to support things that Israel is doing in order to stay friends with America. And they're not interested in that anymore. Because Mr. Mubarak, who was a man I knew, he could recognize me when he saw me. He wasn't necessarily quite sure who I was, but he knew he knew me. Mr. Mubarak was in power a long time, and what happens when you're in power a long time is that eventually you begin to believe what the people working around you say. There are those who suggested that nobody ever told Saddam Hussein things that he didn't want to hear because they may have feared for their lives. But nobody told Donald Rumsfeld things he didn't want to hear because they may have feared for their jobs. But the effect is the same. How am I doing? Oh, God, it's wonderful. It's wonderful, Mr. Mubarak. People love you. There are pictures of you all over town. They worship you. You're a saint. You're a god. I kind of thought so. And if you hear that long enough, you really begin to believe it. This is what happens to many motion picture personalities. They begin to believe that they really are. Charlie Sheen, I suppose we could use as an example. They do begin to think that they're different from and better than most other people. And those of you who have been in positions of a supervisory nature may know how difficult it is to get your subordinates to tell you what they really think. Because a lot of them aren't sure that you really want to hear any deviation from the laudits and the plaudits that you get from ordinary folk. When I'm talking to a group which is a little more mixed in terms of the positions on this issue, I always try to stress the fact that everybody in the room has exactly the same objective. That everybody in the Middle East live in peace and security. And the only thing that divides us is how you get to that worthwhile objective. That's the only real issue. How do you do it? With guns and bullets, or with open arms, or how? Anything in between. But Israel has a parliamentary government. One of the strengths of a parliamentary government is that the majority party rules, but in Israel, as you may be aware, it's very hard to get one party winning half the votes. So what the parties do then is they turn to the splinter parties, some of which are quite peacenik type, some of which are quite warlike types, and you get them to align with you so you have a majority and can form a government. And the last couple of governments in Israel have been right of center, because those are the parties that provided the votes so that Mr. Netanyahu, Mr. Olmert, Mr. Barak could be the prime minister. And because of that, it's kind of like the Tea Party here. I have to digress for just a moment. I lecture on luxury cruise ships. It's a dirty job. Somebody has to do it. They force you to eat, 8 meals a day and visit all these fascinating places. And my wife and I have been doing this for 12 years, and there's an awful lot to like. And we wound up last year on the Kamchatka Peninsula, which sticks down from the east coast of Russia like Florida towards Japan. And the Kamchatka Peninsula used to be part of Japan. The land moves around. They got 42 volcanoes on the peninsula, and a city there called Petropavlovsk. Petropavlovsk, which means the city of Peter, Petrov, and Paul, Pavlov. Okay, it's a Christian foundation. But there's nothing much there. But my wife and I got off and got on this bus. And the guy pointed out, "Oh, that's interesting." And finally, he says, "And now, ladies, gentlemen, I am taking you to a place you will never forget. From top this hill, you can see house of Sarah Palin." That made the whole trip worthwhile. "Hello, Sarah," he says. She's famous. I think that the ideal Republican Party ticket would be Trump and Palin. God, those two together have an IQ which is almost into 3 digits. Basically. All right, sorry. Our relationship with Israel is incredibly costly. Not just in money, but it runs into the billions of dollars, as you may know. You may remember that shortly after being elected, Mr. Obama said $30 billion in the next 10 years. That's a lot of money. I mean, think what you could do with $30 billion. But it's cost us prestige, respect, it's cost us dignity, and it's pushed us into situations where our nation is the world's foremost practitioner of what I call dynamic hypocrisy. Because we got involved in Libya. Excuse me, please. We got involved in Libya because Muammar al-Gaddafi, who has been in power for a long, long time, killed a lot of Libyans, armed, who were rising up against his government in Libya. The Israelis have killed Palestinians in Gaza who were not rising up with arms against them, and they're not Israelis, and they're not in Israel. And the further contrast is that the Israelis use American planes, bombs, cluster bombs, white phosphorus bombs, bullets and tanks. So when Hillary Clinton, who's not an idiot, stands up and says, the United States stands for and supports freedom, justice, democracy, and human rights everywhere, people say, what about over here? That's different. We're not worried about it there. And in fact, we facilitate what the Israelis are doing. The Israelis have the perfect right to do whatever they damn well please. It's a sovereign nation. They can do whatever they please. And other sovereign nations also have the right to do what they think needs to be done in response. And some of them will, some of them have. We don't. We condone all of that. Look, the American Secretary of State was recently in Kosovo. You know about Kosovo? We voted, the world voted to make that a separate country from Serbia because most of the people who live there are Kosovars. So we made it a separate country over the objections of the people in Serbia. And because there had been a war there, an ethnic war, a lot of the Serbs who'd lived in what is now Kosovo had fled. So the United Nations is going to have them come back to their homes and put NATO troops there to protect them so they can reintegrate into the society, and send a team of people in from NATO to help them set up a government, a Kosovar government and all of that. Quite recently, Hillary Clinton was there. I'm not sure if this made it into the papers. Hillary Clinton was on a tour, and she went to the Kosovars and the Serbs, and she said, you must talk. You must talk. Now here's two groups of people, face to face across a blood-soaked border, but there probably are still bodies bouldering. And it didn't happen all that long ago. And you must talk. And America says, Northern Ireland, you must talk. The Catholics and the Protestants. On Cyprus, you Turks, you Greeks, you got to talk. You're right there face to face. Israelis and Palestinians, you got to talk. You Indians and Pakistanis have to talk in Kashmir. But we don't talk to Iran, and they're 6,000 miles away, and we've never had a war with them, but we don't talk to them. So how odd does it look that we keep urging other people to do things that we ourselves don't do? I call this dynamic hypocrisy, because everybody sees precisely what we're doing. You know, you've got to do this, but we're not going to. A question. If that person and this person have a problem between them, and they sit down to talk about it, would you agree that there is a chance that I can either reduce the problem or perhaps resolve it? Yeah. And if they don't talk, there is no chance at all. So we didn't talk to the Iraqis from 1990 until we invaded the second time. Would that have helped? We'll never know, but I would guess yes. It doesn't cost a damn thing to talk. You don't give up anything. You don't have to surrender your rights. You just sit down and say, look, we got this issue. You got this issue. How can we accommodate this kind of business? And if you don't talk, it ain't going to work. But, double underline, you must not ever, ever fall into the trap of talking about Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. Think. Do the guards negotiate with the prisoners? You say negotiations, and people's minds, especially those people who don't follow the situation out there very carefully, this is a negotiation. But in Israel, it's that. The Palestinians cannot do anything but beg. I have met with Palestinian negotiators. All they can do is beg. Could we please? No. That is not a negotiation. You must never, ever let anybody get away with using the phrase, ending the conflict. There's no conflict out there. It's an occupation. A conflict means a war between two nations with armies and borders. The Palestinians have neither. You don't end a conflict, you end the occupation. That's what's driving it, isn't it? But we always talk about ending the occupation, and we always talk about the peace process, but that also is a loaded phrase. Because everybody's for a peace process, but in order to get peace out there, you're going to have to end the occupation, a word that's never used. And it's a weapon, if you will. It's a tool that you can use to get people to understand that the occupation has to end. Think. All right. I have written permission from your leadership to ask you to think. Now, people don't do that to you very often. So to ease the potential shock and trauma, I will tell you when, okay? Think. Optical illusion. Optical illusion. Raise your hand if in the last 5 days you've experienced an optical illusion. Now, anybody wearing glasses ought to have their hand up, because that's what this does. Those letters are not really larger or closer, they just look like it, right? And if you took a picture of your friends, are they really that big? Camera, telescope, microscope, glasses, that's an optical illusion. When I say that, however, you're thinking of the vase that looks like two people kissing. Okay? But you got to think, all right? Let's try this one now. Think. On a map, time zones run north and south, and sometimes they have little wiggles to get a river in or an island or something. On the globe of the Earth, the time zones all come together at the North Pole. So if you're standing right on the North Pole, what time is it? Now, I usually have somebody planted in the audience who says, well, it depends upon which direction you're facing. And I said, you're right. But think, when you're standing right on the North Pole, there's only one direction you can face, south. You can't look east or west or north. You can only look south. Okay. So I do this I'm trying to get minds open, because people don't think about a lot of things that they're pretty sure they know, especially if they think they know it. So when you get into these discussions, you can't let people use words which cloud the mind. I introduce myself to American audiences as a Middle East expert, and I say I can say that with confidence because unlike the overwhelming majority of Americans, I know where it is. Most Americans haven't got a clue. You know, it's in the middle somewhere, towards the east. Yeah. And by the way, notice how we call it the Middle East. Middle East from where?
Europe.
It's from Europe. You know, we had the Far East and the Middle East and the Near East, and that's kind of ethnocentric or egocentric, because it's west from other places. Okay. Don't let them talk about peace process or ending the conflict, and you must not ever let them get away with saying that once Hamas recognizes Israel, see, it's going to be okay. Recognize, I have met with a man named Hassan Nasrallah, who is the head of Hezbollah. I have met with Khalid Mishal, who is the leader, the political spokesman for Hamas. I have met with Bashar al-Assad, who, as you may know, speaks excellent English. He's a British-trained ophthalmologist. And they say, how come you Americans keep bellowing about recognition? What is it that they're recognizing? You recognize a country which has a capital city and borders which are internationally recognized. Israel has neither one of those. Its capital, they say, is Jerusalem. No. And where are the borders of Israel? So you can't recognize something like that. Has anybody ever suggested that Israel should recognize Palestine? Not only that, but groups of people don't recognize nations. And Hamas, for example, Palestinian,